So I was just looking at the top 10 companies in the world by market capitalization. And what I realized is that 7 of the top 10 companies are there because they have successfully mastered and exploited the greatest business force in the modern world, which is something called the network effect, which is a theory that was popularized in the 20th century and really came of age in the end of the 20th century, which is called the network effect, which is essentially, in simple terms, stating that the value of a product or service becomes more useful the more people that adopt it. So if one person buys the product, it makes it fundamentally more useful for the second person who buys it. And the second person who bought it made it more useful for the person who already bought it. And so this, in today's world, might seem obvious. And the only reason it seems that way is because we live in the network economy, even though we don't know that. But for the majority of human history and the majority of capitalism's history, companies were not network effect companies. All the industrialists, Rockefeller, Carnegie, Morgan, you name it, they wouldn't have understood. They might have understood it because they were brilliant, but their businesses were not fundamentally network effect businesses. They built a product, usually something that was a step change in a commodity or something where it was fundamentally innovating in the Industrial Revolution. It was something that was valuable for their customer. Their customer agreed to pay them for it, and they sold a lot of it. The best example I could give there is Ford and the Ford Motor Company. Henry Ford sold a car to you doesn't make the next guy buying a Ford, doesn't make his experience better. Maybe there's some indirect psychological network effect, but doesn't actually make the next guy's experience with the product better. However, the companies that are dominating the world today and that will continue to do so are exclusively network effect beneficiaries. So let me just name the top 10 companies in the world. Number 1 is NVIDIA. Number 2 is Alphabet, Google. Number 3 is Apple. 4 is Microsoft. 5 is Amazon. 6 is Saudi Aramco. 7 is TSMC. 8 is Broadcom. 9 is Meta. 10 is Tesla. So I'll remove TSMC, Saudi Aramco, and Broadcom from this list. And even I do believe they benefit from network effects, especially industrial network effects, which can maybe cover in a different video. But let's remove them from this list because they're more of a conventional business. The other 7 are so directly benefiting from network effects, it's unreal. Even NVIDIA, who sells hardware, is a huge network effect business because of their programming language, CUDA, which has achieved dominance in the way that people have to engage with the NVIDIA hardware. So that even NVIDIA, a company that makes most of its money selling hardware, is a network effect beneficiary. Other companies are so preposterously network effect companies that it's that almost their entire business model. But now, what does this say about the world, and what is this concept called the network effect? Who came up with it? How do you benefit from it? Let's take a little history lesson. So I tried to do a lot of research as to who came up with this theory that, okay, if you have a business where the more people that buy your product, it becomes so much more useful for everybody else that already bought your product and will buy it in the future. Who came up with it? Because it's so brilliant and it's so ingrained in our culture today. Where did it start? And the first real business leader that I've seen speak about it, that has conceptualized it, actually dates back to the early 1900s. It's a guy named Theodore Vail, who was the president of the Bell Telecommunications Company. And his point was that by one of the forces that is going to create the adoption of the telephone is the network effect, and the telephone is now the quintessential example of the network effect. The telephone also is the first business where if you only sold one telephone, if you were Alexander Graham Bell, you created the first telephone, an incredible accomplishment, one of the great accomplishments in all of human history, life-changing, civilizational changing, incredible. The first telephone is useless. Even though it worked, you have nobody else to call. And so the telephone is such a network effect business because every additional connected device in a telecommunications network increases the value, which we're going to get into mathematically how it does that, of the network and of the people that already own the telephone. So let's say you had one telephone, useless. 2 telephones, now you could call that person, they can call you. That's marginal utility. What about 10 telephones? Now all 10 of those people can interact with all 10 of those people. So it's not a value increase of 10, it's a value exponential increase of 10 to the power of 10. Because the number of connections just goes quadratic every additional node you add into this. What happens when you have 1 billion telephones? Now you have an irremovable part of society, and if you are like Bell Labs or AT&T, you monopolize that market in the early days, you have a cash gushing machine. You have a business that's so difficult to compete. Somebody else could create a better phone, but they don't have the network effect. And then, of course, if you take this into the modern era, it's unbelievable, right? So Google, Google has probably the best product. Definitely when they started, the best search engine in the world, and maybe an argument today that they still have the best search engine in the world, but you wouldn't know because you don't try any other search engine, because they have the network effect. They have all of the users and they have all the advertisers, and that's just the direct network effect, not to mention the data that then gets reinforced into the network, which makes their product better. But if you just look at it on surface value, all the advertisers want to be with all the users, and all the users want to be with all the advertisers. So when Google started out, every additional advertiser, every additional user that they added to the network, not to mention the people that own the websites that are being indexed by Google, this creates this connection density for every additional node in this network, which makes Google impossible to dispense with. And so Google, obvious, and Apple, another hardware company, but look at, just as a menial example in the Apple universe, one of the biggest reasons people don't switch away from Apple products is because they love iMessage. And the interconnectivity of their Apple devices with their friends' Apple devices, like AirDrop, but definitely iMessage. So Apple, which could have been displaced because clearly there are better and maybe more economically beneficial, like more bang for your buck cell phones, nobody wants to get out of that Apple network. Microsoft, absolutely another network effect business. Even though primarily sold software in the early days, they figured out the idea that we had to build the first developer platform with .NET, and that made all the developers program applications for originally DOS, that later ended up becoming Windows. And once you had that, you had the linchpin in this gigantic explosion of the personal computer, which made all the users want to use all these applications, and boom, Microsoft. Amazon. I don't need to explain why Amazon is incredible. One of the greatest network effect businesses of all time. And then skipping Saudi Aramco, skipping TSMC, skipping Broadcom, and going to Meta. I think Meta is what Theodore Vail envisioned when he was talking about the network effect. Meta is literally a product with zero functional utility apart from the other people on the platform. It's not even like Amazon or Apple or Microsoft, where the network effect is a tangential reinforcing function. Meta, if you just were the only person there, would have negative utility to your life. And Zuckerberg and the team understood that, and they wanted to create that connection density and create the greatest network effect business in the world. This is why we all WhatsApp today, because everyone else is on WhatsApp. Well, Instagram today, because everyone else is on Instagram. And then I'll make another video, but when you create a network effect, you create a social layer, not social media, but a socializing layer, which then creates hierarchical standards within that network effect, like Instagram did with likes and comments. This is like unbelievable reinforcement. It's almost impossible to compete with. And Tesla, again, a company that sells hardware, but without the network effect of the training data that all these Tesla users are contributing, you would not be the leader in self-driving and today with the other innovations they're making in robotics. And so it's unbelievable that today people are building a business without taking advantage of the network effect. Now, let me put this in financial terms. There was a guy who came along in the 1980s and he invented the telephone was a seismic invention. This guy's invention was equivalently seismic. He invented the Ethernet, which is obviously the underpinnings of the modern internet. He was one of the co-creators of the Ethernet. And what he hypothesized was, his name is Metcalfe, and what he hypothesized was that the financial value and or influence of a network is proportional to the squaring of the number of connections in the network. Sorry, not number of connections, number of participants in the network. So what he would say is, and this is putting it in mathematical terms of what Theodore Vail and them had seen almost a century earlier, what Robert Metcalfe would say is, okay, if there are 10 nodes in the network, 10 telephones, he actually hypothesized about connected devices as well. And then later, George Gilder would assign this Metcalfe's law to users, so user platforms like Facebook. So, but think about this. This basically what he's saying is, if there are 10 people on the platform, then the number of connections is such that the value of that network is 10 to the power of 2. So you can proportionally scale the financial value of a business 10 to the power of 2 if there are 10 participants in that network. Now imagine 1 billion participants. You are talking about financial value and financial capture at a scale that is incomprehensible to the human mind. And that is simply because the number of potential connections, is so insanely parabolic when you go to the power of 2, and he's completely right. You just need to draw it out and you will see how many people can benefit from the other person being a part of it in an entity like Facebook or in an entity like Microsoft, Amazon, of course, Google, etc. And so he created Metcalfe's law, is named after him, and now it's been applied to basically any internet business, online business. So where does this leave you? Of course, at Garage, we literally created the term, the network economy. We believe everything in Garage is a network effect. The affiliates, the founders, the business owners, the customers are all nodes in the network that then amplify the value of the network. And we're betting on the fact that we're going to be able to redistribute that financial value that Facebook kept for itself to the participants of the network. That's probably where we're differentiated. But where does this leave you as a business owner on Garage or off of Garage? And you may be selling a more conventional product that is not a platform or a network by design. You may be selling a physical good, or you may be selling a service. What you have to do is you have to now create a layer in your business which does benefit from the network effect. You have to create a community. You have to create a network of people that makes it so that every additional person that buys your product or service reinforces the value that is given to existing and future customers. Now, we're going to make an entire course, an entire series of videos free, of course, explaining how you can do that. But that is mandatory prerequisite to doing business in the 21st century, as these companies have proven.